Akaroa Civic Trust.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity of making this submission. I'm doing so on behalf of Dr. John Wilson, who was the author of this submission. John is a heritage author, and he lives at Arthur's Pass, so he was delighted when I volunteered to give this submission so he can stay up in his misty Erie. Like many submissions from the Akaroa Civic Trust, this one is also about tourism and heritage. Obviously, the first point of the submission regarding cruise ships has altered significantly with the agreement between yourselves and the port company that wharfage be built in Lyttelton, and that will, I hope, to some extent relieve the pressure on Akaroa. The heavy number of cruise ships, sometimes up to 86 a year, arriving in Akaroa over the last 6 years, has intermittently divided the community between those who see economic opportunity and those who see a diminution of their amenity. That has been unfortunate. It's tended to be a seasonal thing. It has happened around Christmas time and has often been exacerbated by somebody from the press phoning somebody, getting an opinion, and then finding all the other opinions, and then it fades away again. But the issue, nonetheless, has had an effect on the community of Akaroa. I note that Akaroa, whether or not the cruise ships continue to come in the same numbers, is very much a tourism hot spot. And with the projected increase in the numbers of tourists arriving in New Zealand, it is likely to remain so. And I know I sometimes get the impression that people from Akaroa bang on about Akaroa an awful lot. But, you know, really the place deserves a significant amount of special attention, simply because it is a remarkable and unique settlement. For that reason only, if you like. It's the first successful planned settlement of New Zealand. It's got a Maori history that is of national significance. So really the fact that cruise ships might decrease in numbers, I think, is offset by the likely rise in tourism over the next few years. So in the recommendations on John's submission here, there are three. The first, really, I don't think is pertinent, because the decisions around the acceptance of cruise ships into the harbour are made by the harbour master, Jim Dilley. And I've spoken to him on this issue of restricting the number of cruise ships to one at a time. And he referred me, as harbour masters will, to the Marine Transport Act of 1994, which clearly states that in order to maintain maritime safety, he is obliged to accept visits from cruise ships when requested, despite the fact that we're talking about planning, and rather than May Day, it seems to be the case that restricting the numbers to one at a time isn't a realistic option. The second point, asking for further research into the impacts of mass tourism in Akaroa, is a bigger point. You will hear, as you just have, from Victoria, and I believe from another submitter, that there have been numerous reports on Akaroa over the years. Streetscape report, historic area, harbour basin settlements, there is a number of them. And yet they never seem to actually hold water or bear fruit, if I'm going to mix metaphors. We need a strategy for coping with tourism in Akaroa. Dare I suggest that there could even be an Akaroa desk here in the City Council where all this information is held by somebody who's responsible to filter it and guide other members of staff when they are making decisions, especially about the historic area of Akaroa. At the moment, people are exercised about the fact that we are going to have yellow dotted corners on the streets to aid people who have disabilities as far as sight is concerned. Well, yes, but, this is a precinct in its own right, and those sorts of incursions don't really help. So that, I believe, the second point in the recommendation there still holds. Whether or not it's possible to raise a levy from tourists coming in over the wharf, which the City Council does have jurisdiction over, is another matter. But whatever, the residents of Akaroa have always desired a quid pro quo for the effects that tourism from cruise ships has had on their community. I'm well aware of the millions of dollars that the City Council is spending on infrastructure, water and wastewater, but the residents of the settlement have always imagined that they could see some sort of reflection of the fact that they are now entertaining up to 5,000 visitors a day, sometimes when there are 2 or 3 cruise ships in the harbour at the same time, that there is some payback for that. So I think those 3, I've addressed those 3 points, but certainly there is room for action on the second 2. As for the retention of what is known as Jeannie's Cottage, the recommendations or the decision sought there is that council retains that property in its ownership and that it should be used by volunteer groups. I've spoken to the deputy chair of the Banks Peninsula Community Board, and she tells me that a report is coming back to them in June on this very issue. So I think that all I can do here is to support verbally those 2 decisions which are sought. I knew Jeannie very well. She was a long-time resident of Akaroa through the 60s and 70s. She had the first tea shop there. She was a girl guide mistress. She was one of those people, a spinster, who was always around and involved in everything culturally in the village. And her property, or the property which she rented from Banks Peninsula District Council originally, is in a very prominent place on the corner of Rue Jolie, which abuts the cricket ground. So as you drive into Akaroa, your eye is taken by the cricket ground there, and there right in front of you is this cottage, which fits perfectly into the built landscape of the village. It needs to be raised on its foundations because it's subject to flooding. One of the members of the Civic Trust, Rodney Laredo, has been in touch with a company who is prepared to do some pro bono work on raising that cottage, which might be of significant help to the council if it is to enter into that work. So those, I think, are the most significant things I want to say in delivering this submission. Encouraging support for the retention of Jeannie's Cottage and looking harder at the impacts of tourism on a small community of only 650 people. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for a question. Pauline.
Thanks, Steve. You might not know the answer. What's the population of Akaroa, the residents, not the tourists?
650.
650?
Yeah.
When they can swell to 5,000 a day.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, I mean, that's a
Well,
huge impact.
The residents stay at home. They generally have a list on their fridge which tells them when the cruise ships are coming in. They don't go out.
Thank you.
No, that's very good. Look, thank you very much, Steve. I much
Okay.
appreciate your presentation today, and obviously we'll be considering these matters very carefully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, tram